It was a typical sunny afternoon in Fort Collins, Colorado. The park was alive with the sound of children's laughter, the rhythmic thud of joggers' footsteps, and the soft chatter of families gathered beneath the shade of towering oak trees. Nature's peaceful hum blended perfectly with the vibrant life around it. In the midst of this lively scene, a lone figure sat on a bench near the pond, her gaze fixed on the pages of the thick hardcover book resting in her lap. Camille, a well-respected attorney in the city, had carved out a rare moment for herself. The demands of her high-powered legal career had left little room for downtime, but today, she had decided to steal a brief escape from the hustle, immersing herself in the world of fiction. The serenity of the moment, however, was soon shattered by a sharp screeching noise, the unmistakable sound of tires skidding against the pavement. Camille looked up just as a police cruiser slid to a halt by the curb. The vehicle's arrival drew the attention of a few nearby onlookers who slowed their pace to see what was happening. Two officers emerged from the car, their faces set in stone, the aura of authority that surrounded them almost palpable. They scanned the park quickly before their eyes landed on Camille. In an instant, the quiet woman on the bench became their target. "Ma'am, may we have a word with you?" One of the officers called out, his voice flat, carrying the hint of suspicion rather than polite curiosity. Camille looked up slowly, her expression calm and unfazed. She closed her book gently, not a flicker of anxiety crossing her face. "Of course," she replied, her voice steady and composed. The second officer, stepping a little closer, narrowed his eyes. His tone became more clipped as he spoke. "We've received a call about suspicious activity in this area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Camille raised an eyebrow, her confusion palpable. Suspicious activity? She glanced around the park, where joggers continued their routines and children played without a care in the world. Suspicious activity? "I'm just sitting here reading," she said, raising the book slightly to emphasize her point, as if it could somehow validate her presence. But the officers didn't seem convinced. "Can we see some ID?" the first officer demanded. Her pulse quickened, but Camille remained composed, her mind already assessing the situation with the precision of a seasoned lawyer. "I don't understand. What exactly is the reason for this request?" "It's routine," the second officer responded quickly, though there was an undertone to his words that implied anything but routine. The small crowd that had begun to gather around them started murmuring, some curious, others uncomfortable with the escalating tension between the officers and Camille. Camille sighed, frustration stirring within her. She had faced tense moments in courtrooms before, but this felt different. There was no logic here, no respect for the boundaries of civil interaction. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. Her refusal seemed to trigger something in the officers. The first officer's expression hardened, his posture becoming more aggressive. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped. "We're just doing our job." Camille felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she quelled it with an effort. "I know the law," she responded calmly. "I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park." The officer didn't seem to care for her legal knowledge. He stepped forward suddenly, grabbing her arm as though she were about to flee. "You're resisting," he accused, his voice rising. Camille flinched at the harsh grip, the sting of injustice beginning to bite at her patience. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp with disbelief. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, the voices rising in a wave of unease. A man stepped forward, his phone in hand, capturing the scene as the officers continued to press their charge. "Stop resisting," the officer barked again, the words more for show than anything else. Camille felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap tightly around her wrists, the sensation of her freedom slipping away in an instant. Humiliation coursed through her, but Camille fought to stay composed. She was a professional, and though this situation was absurd, she wasn't about to let them see her crumble. The officers began to lead her toward the police cruiser, their faces grim, as the crowd watched in silence. As Camille was escorted to the car, she turned her head to glance at the onlookers. She caught the gaze of a young woman holding up her phone, her eyes filled with a silent plea to document what was unfolding. Camille knew this wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger. But the moment she was shoved into the back seat of the police cruiser, the doors slamming shut, the realization hit her with full force. This was only the beginning. Inside the cruiser, the silence was stifling. The hum of the police radio crackled faintly in the background, but Camille was lost in her thoughts. The absurdity of the situation clung to her like a second skin. Here she was, a well-established attorney, a woman who had spent years defending the rights of others, now on the receiving end of an unjust arrest. She couldn't help but feel the bitter sting of irony. The ride to the station felt interminable. Each passing moment seemed to stretch longer than the last, and with every inch of ground they covered, Camille's anger grew more pronounced. How had something as simple as reading a book in a public park escalated into this? How could she, someone who had spent her entire career fighting for justice, now be subjected to this dehumanizing experience? When they finally arrived at the station, things only worsened. The booking process was invasive, a humiliating routine that seemed designed to strip her of every ounce of dignity. They photographed her, fingerprinted her, and led her to a small, cold-holding cell. The fluorescent lights above buzzed incessantly, adding to the feeling of isolation. "Enjoy your stay," one of the officers sneered as he slammed the cell door behind her. Camille sat on the cold metal bench, her hands clasped tightly together. She replayed the events from the park over and over, trying to make sense of it all. She had done nothing wrong. She hadn't resisted. She hadn't been aggressive. But none of that seemed to matter to the officers. The only thing that mattered was their power, and she was the one who had become its target. Time passed slowly, each minute dragging on in agonizing silence. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a young officer came to the cell with a clipboard in hand. "Miss Johnson," he said flatly, his voice distant, "you've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer." Camille sat up straighter. Her voice, though tinged with frustration, was still controlled. "On what grounds?" The officer shrugged. "You can discuss that in court." He turned and walked away without another word. Camille exhaled slowly, her mind racing. The charges were baseless. She knew that. But she also knew this fight would not be easy. Cases like hers rarely were. But she had no intention of backing down. She would take this to court. She would make them answer for their actions. The hours dragged on before she was released on bail. As she walked out of the station into the cool night air, she felt a pang of relief, but it was tempered by the overwhelming sense of injustice. This was far from over. Camille wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. The days that followed Camille's arrest were a blur of confusion, anger, and disbelief. The events in the park had shaken her to her core, not just because of the injustice she'd faced, but because of the overwhelming sense of helplessness that had followed her through the entire ordeal. But Camille wasn't someone who crumbled under pressure. In fact, this was a side of herself she hadn't been in touch with for a long time. The fierce woman who would fight for what was right, no matter the cost. And as she sat in the quiet solitude of her office, sifting through the mounting paperwork, a fire began to burn within her once again. Her phone rang, the sharp chime breaking through the silence. It was a number she didn't recognize, but instinctively, she knew who it was. "Hello, Camille?" The voice on the other end was that of her colleague, Simon Evans, a fellow attorney at the firm where she had worked for the past 8 years. "I'm here, Simon. What's going on?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with a subtle edge of anticipation. She had been expecting this call. There were few who knew about her situation, but those who did had been reaching out, concerned about her well-being. It wasn't every day that a respected attorney found herself in a police holding cell. "I've seen the news," Simon continued, his tone low, measured. It's not looking good, Camille. The story's already out there. People are talking." Camille's jaw tightened. She had known the potential fallout, but hearing it so plainly, so openly discussed, made it all too real. "I figured as much," she muttered, her fingers drumming against the surface of her desk in a rhythmic pattern. "But I won't let this go. I didn't do anything wrong." Simon's voice softened, sensing her growing frustration. "I know you didn't, but you need to be careful. The media's got hold of this, and they're running with it. You could be facing more than just a court case." The weight of his words hung in the air between them. Camille had worked her entire career to build a reputation of integrity and dedication. Now, that very reputation was under attack, and though she knew she was in the right, the stain of this scandal would be hard to wash away. "I'm not backing down, Simon," she said firmly, her words unwavering. "I'll fight this, and I'll make sure they know what they did." As the conversation came to an end, Camille leaned back in her chair, eyes closed, breathing deeply. The storm outside had picked up, thunder rumbling in the distance, echoing the turmoil within her. But Camille knew that this moment, this test of strength, would be the defining moment of her career. If she could face this injustice head-on and overcome it, nothing could stop her from achieving what she had set out to do in her professional life. The next few days were filled with preparation, gathering evidence, speaking with witnesses, and digging into the intricacies of the law that governed situations like hers. Her legal mind was sharp, and she began to craft a strategy that would not only clear her name but hold the officers accountable for their actions. She knew that winning this case wasn't just about her. It was about something much larger. This was a chance to challenge the system, to stand up for those who had been wronged, and to make sure that no one else would face the same kind of treatment she had. Meanwhile, the media frenzy surrounding her arrest only intensified. News outlets were quick to spin the story, portraying Camille as an entitled professional who had lost her temper with the police. The narrative was far from the truth, but Camille's face was plastered across the front pages, with headlines like "Local Attorney Arrested for Resisting Arrest in Public Park" splashed across every news site. Social media didn't help either. Her name trended on Twitter, the hashtags #CamilleJohnson and #PoliceBrutality trending for all the wrong reasons. Some people rallied behind her, applauding her courage, while others threw stones, calling her arrogant and entitled. It was a cacophony of opinions, and Camille found herself caught in the middle of it all. But in the midst of it all, Camille focused on the task at hand. She knew that she couldn't allow the noise to distract her. She had work to do, and she had a reputation to rebuild. Every interaction she had from here on out would be scrutinized, analyzed, and judged. She could feel the eyes of the world on her, and it weighed heavily on her shoulders. But Camille wasn't one to back down. The courtroom was her domain, the place where she had spent years building her career, defending those who couldn't defend themselves. And now, it would be her battleground. It wasn't just her name on the line. It was the integrity of the legal system itself. If she could expose the flaws, the corruption, and the mistreatment she had endured, maybe, just maybe, she could bring about some semblance of justice. A week later, Camille stood in front of a judge, her heart pounding in her chest. The courtroom was packed with reporters and onlookers, their eyes glued to her every move. She was no longer just a lawyer. She was a symbol of defiance. The prosecutor was a seasoned veteran, known for his ruthless tactics, but Camille wasn't intimidated. She had been in far worse situations before. This was just another fight, one she was more than prepared for. "Your Honor," Camille began, her voice clear and commanding as she addressed the judge. "I stand before you today not just as an attorney, but as someone who has been wronged by those who were supposed to protect and serve. I was unlawfully detained, humiliated, and unjustly charged. And today, I will prove that what happened to me was not an isolated incident. It was a blatant violation of my rights." The judge nodded, his expression unreadable. He had seen many cases in his time, but Camille's was different. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been subjected to unjust treatment, everyone whose voice had been silenced. The proceedings moved quickly, and Camille's legal team was relentless. They presented the evidence, the witness statements, the video footage, and the damning inconsistencies in the officers' testimonies. Slowly, Camille could see the case beginning to unravel for the other side. But it wasn't just the case that was unraveling. It was the power dynamic. The officers who had arrested her were no longer the unquestioned authority figures. They were vulnerable, exposed for the unjustified treatment they had meted out. Camille's pursuit of justice wasn't just for her. It was for every person who had ever been unjustly treated by those meant to protect them. By the end of the day, Camille had won the first round. The charges against her were dismissed, and the officers involved were placed under investigation. The courtroom erupted in quiet applause, a silent acknowledgement of Camille's victory, but also the recognition that there was still more work to be done. When Camille walked out of the courthouse that day, she felt the weight of the world begin to lift off her shoulders. But it wasn't over yet. The fight had just begun. There was still much to be done, not just for her, but for the countless others who had been wronged by a system that needed to be held accountable. Days bled into weeks, and the noise from the media seemed to grow louder with every passing hour. Camille found herself consumed by the storm swirling around her, but she refused to let it define her. Every headline that misrepresented her, every gossip-filled article, only pushed her to work harder, to fight smarter, and to regain control over her narrative. She wasn't just battling the legal system or the officers involved. She was battling a public perception that sought to tear her down. Yet, Camille had never been one to shrink away from a fight. With her case now in the public eye, the pressure mounted. Camille's every move was being scrutinized. She became an emblem of both defiance and controversy, depending on who you asked. To some, she was a hero, an attorney standing up against injustice, exposing the flaws of the police force. To others, she was a villain, an arrogant, entitled professional who had overreacted to a situation that could have been avoided. But Camille knew the truth, and that truth was worth fighting for. Camille's office had always been her sanctuary, the place where she crafted her arguments, made her decisions, and fought for justice. But now, every visit felt like a battleground. The walls of her office, once filled with files and legal documents, now seemed to close in around her as she navigated this fight. Not just for her reputation, but for something much larger. It wasn't just her name she was trying to restore. It was the integrity of the justice system itself. She met with her legal team more frequently now, pulling all-nighters to prepare for the coming days in court. They combed through every detail, dissected every piece of evidence, and analyzed the actions of the officers involved with laser precision. Camille knew that this case wasn't just about winning. It was about making a statement. If she could expose the truth, she could challenge the systemic issues that had allowed this kind of injustice to occur. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings and strategy sessions, Camille stood at her window, gazing out at the city skyline. The city had always felt like a place of endless opportunities, a place where justice could prevail if you fought hard enough. But lately, it had felt like a labyrinth, full of dead ends and false leads. She wasn't sure if she could ever regain the sense of hope she once had. Still, something deep inside her refused to give in to despair. "I'm not going to let them win," she whispered to herself, as if speaking to the city below. But it wasn't just about fighting for herself anymore. She realized that her battle was bigger than her personal pain. It was a chance to right the wrongs not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been mistreated, misunderstood, or falsely accused. Camille's case was a reflection of a broken system, and the more she dug into the truth, the clearer it became that she had a responsibility to do more than just clear her name. She had to make sure that no one else would suffer the same way she had. The day of the next hearing arrived, and Camille stood before the judge once more, her heart beating in her chest like a drum. She had prepared for this day for weeks, gathering every shred of evidence, every witness statement, and every argument that would demonstrate her innocence. But this time, she wasn't just standing for herself. She was standing for the many others who had been crushed by a system that failed them. Her voice echoed through the courtroom, steady and resolute as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor," she began, "I stand before you not only to defend myself, but to defend the values that the law was built upon. The events that transpired that day in the park were not just an assault on me. They were an assault on the very principles of justice and fairness. If we allow this to go unchallenged, we risk losing the integrity of our entire legal system." The judge nodded thoughtfully, his eyes trained on Camille as she spoke. The courtroom was silent, every person present hanging on her every word. For the first time, Camille felt like her voice had power, not just in the legal sense, but in a way that resonated beyond the walls of the courthouse. Her legal team worked seamlessly, methodically laying out the case in her favor. They presented compelling evidence, witness testimonies, video footage, and expert analyses that demonstrated the officer's misconduct and the violation of Camille's rights. The prosecution struggled to maintain its footing as Camille's defense tore through their arguments with precision. With every counterpoint, every challenge, Camille could feel the tide of the case slowly turning in her favor. But there was still one moment that stood out to her more than any other. As the trial neared its conclusion, Camille took a deep breath and stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. She looked directly at the judge, her voice steady but full of conviction. "This case isn't just about me. It's about every person who has been wronged by those in power. It's about restoring trust in the system, about holding accountable those who think they are above the law. If we cannot hold the officers who abuse their authority accountable, then we are all at risk of becoming victims of a broken system." The weight of her words lingered in the air. Camille knew that her argument wasn't just a defense for herself, it was a call to action. She wasn't asking for sympathy, she was demanding justice. The judge deliberated for what felt like an eternity. The courtroom was tense, every person holding their breath as they awaited his verdict. And then, finally, the gavel came down. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, the judge said, his voice grave, "The charges against Ms. Camille Johnson are hereby dismissed. Furthermore, an investigation will be launched into the actions of the officers involved in this matter. Justice, as we know, is not a one-way street, and the truth will always prevail." The room erupted into a quiet hum of murmurs, and Camille felt her heart race. It was a victory, not just for her, but for the truth. She had done it. She had not only cleared her name, but also exposed the corruption and abuse that had been allowed to fester within the system. The relief she felt was indescribable, but she knew that the battle wasn't over. As Camille left the courthouse that day, the weight of the world lifted from her shoulders. She had fought hard, and now justice had been served. But she also knew this wasn't the end. The fight for justice was ongoing, and her victory was just one small step toward a larger, more meaningful change. And as Camille stepped into the future, she did so with the unwavering belief that she could change the system. One case, one person, one victory at a time.